In this video, we're painting some retro Khorne Berserkers from 2nd edition 40k, discussing their rules from that period, and perhaps I will even sing you a song. Khorne Berserkers, Berserkers of Khorne. It is to my Chaos smorgasbord I will be adding these traitor space marines and servants of the blood god. In contemporary 40k, one usually collects one type of traitor legion or warband, but in 2nd edition 40k, you could have a mix of everything. So far, I have Black Legion Terminators and Nurgle Plague Marines, so after appealing to Nurgle, I decided to try my chances with Khorne and see what he has to offer. People shop around for energy suppliers and car insurance, so why not do the same with your ruinous powers? I've always been a fan of these servants of the blood god, ever since I first saw them in 90s publications, such as White Dwarf or the 2nd edition rulebook. I particularly like the accompanying artwork at this time, such as this gentleman with his massive fist standing on a sea of skulls, or this guy from the front of the Codex, and this dude from an old epic box. And let's not forget Azrak the Annihilator. Maybe it's the red and gold that endears me, or the angry helmets, or the ridiculous headgear, or maybe it's all of them. I remember trying to sculpt a Khorne headpiece when I was 12, to convert a monopose loyalist marine into a servant of the blood god, but I hadn't discovered green stuff at the time, so I used blue tack, and, well, you can imagine how well that went. When I was younger, I had limited pocket money, and I had wholly thrown in my lot with Dante and his blood angels. But now I am older, significantly older, I am in a better position to own all the retro models younger me was denied. It's just a case of tracking them down. But luckily, my buddy Warhammer from Instagram did me a solid and donated some of the old plastic monopose World Eaters for my Chaos collection, so these will make up the majority of the squad. Back in the early to mid-90s, they came in a box of 10 identical miniatures in 4 parts each: torso, backpack, bolter arm, and base. The backpack and bolter came with the symbol of Khorne, which distinguished them from the other plastic parts available at the time. I'm using 4 of these, and to one I've swapped the bolter arm for another to add some variety to the squad. The 5th Berserker is this metal sculpt, which was not cheap, let me tell you. All metal sculpts of World Eaters from this era are beautiful in my opinion. The detail is incredible, and I particularly appreciate the exposed power cables to remind us that this is an ancient piece of power armour, probably from the times of the heresy, perhaps kit-bashed from various scavenged components. I wish these metal models were easier to come by. As with many items from this time, prices per model were high. Corny as it might sound, I keep my ear to the ground, and perhaps one day I'll be able to add some more to my collection. I suppose there were the plastic Zerkers from 3rd edition, but they don't endear me as much as this chap. He can be my champion for this project. For the purposes of showcasing the paint job, I'm going to show you how I painted a metal miniature and a plastic miniature from the time. I have 5 models in total, but the other 3 are basically the same as the plastic one, and I am painting them all at the same time. So I lined up these little warriors on my low-tech spraying stick and primed them with white from Halfred's White Primer. Vibrancy is the goal here, and I want my retro grimdark butchers to be bright and garish and reasonably close to the paint job you find in the colour pages of the 2nd edition rulebook. After the prime, I took some Vallejo Dark Vermilion, a paint not entirely unlike Citadel Evil Sun Scarlet. I thinned it with some flow improver and slopped it all over the armour for the first thin coat. Some parts of the model I left white, since it didn't seem worth painting on the bolter or the chainsword, which I would base coat black later. It just didn't seem worth wasting the red paint on those areas. But there were some areas I painted red anyway, even though they would be other colours. My only logic here was it would have taken more time to paint more carefully at the base coat stage. So with the first coat dried, I went all ahead Duncan and painted the second thin coat, covering all the same areas that were red before on the metal and plastic model. And when that was dry, it was time for some shading, and my shade colour of choice was Raglan Flesh Shade. Now I didn't use this to shade the whole model. Indeed, to save effort with clean-up later, I avoided the large round or flat areas entirely. I was careful around the armour joint recesses, using only the minimum amount of wash on my brush. However, I was somewhat more liberal when painting the more detailed sections, since they had more recesses and therefore surface area to absorb the paint. Around the shoulder pad trims, I actually used a thinned brown paint and used a size 0 brush to paint a sharp line. I feel the shade here would have overspilled too much. Sure, other methods exist, but this one I felt most comfortable with. Next, I painted the bolt gun and the chainsword black, along with the pouches around his person, and some of the vents on the backpack. And when the shading was dry, I tidied up the red armour panels with more of the original red I used. Now, I don't always tidy up these if I know a decal is going on there afterwards, and any mistakes can be turned into battle damage. Nevertheless, I wanted this paint job to be relatively clean, in honour of paint schemes from the Rogue Trader / 2nd edition transition days. Off camera, I noticed I hadn't trimmed every mould line, and I could tell some of these were going to stand out like a sore thumb. Regrettably, this meant shaving off some of the paint as well. What can I say? I am only human. Now once the red base and the shading was secure, I mixed some dark vermilion and Trollslayer orange to get the first highlight on the go. Using my smallest brush, I painted on a thick edge highlight around the sharpest armour edges to begin to form a sort of gradient in these places. On camera, this doesn't look like it's making much difference, but in hindsight, I am glad I took the time to do it. With pure Trollslayer orange, I painted a slightly sharper highlight around the same edges. Then, mixing Barbarian Flesh with a dot of orange, I painted the sharpest highlights around these edges with the thinnest line I could muster. I would be lying if I said I didn't go purple in the face, holding my breath to keep my hand steady in the most fiddly areas, but there was no fainting on this occasion. In the next stage, I wanted to paint the rims of the headgear and shoulder pads gold. My inspiration was a paint job I found in the 40k 2nd edition rulebook, in those glorious heavy metal photos in the centre pages. It featured 4 World Eaters Space Marines with far more detail than I could achieve at my current skill level, but I liked the colour combination they used here. Clearly a metallic gold was used on these minis, and so off camera I tested this out, but I wasn't very happy with the outcome. So instead, like one who hates his life, I opted for a sort of non-metallic metal. I say sort of because I have never quite achieved this perfectly, but that wasn't an obstacle. Like many of us, I am but a work in progress, and if I put off painting until I achieve perfection, I would never paint at all. In the 2nd edition Codex Chaos, Khorne Berserkers are said to have a link between bloodshed and pleasure so strong that they are virtually uncontrollable on or off the battlefield. I concede that these static miniatures are more on the side of stoic than a typical berserker, but never mind. Khorne Berserkers revel in hand-to-hand combat, eager to offer blood and skulls to Khorne via the swinging of their favoured chainaxe or chainsword. They have even been known to fall on their own weapons as a self-sacrifice to the blood god. In the rules, their profile is the same as a regular Chaos Space Marine, if traitor Marines can even be deemed vanilla. However, Terminators with the Mark of Khorne have an additional pip of weapon skill, ballistic skill, initiative, and leadership. All Berserkers have the Mark of Khorne, and in this edition, This meant their save was increased by 1, so these warriors have a 2+ save rather than 3+. They also have Frenzy, which was one of several psychological states in this edition, which govern models' behaviour. This has the following effects. Frenzied troops must charge enemies within charge distance at the start of their turn, and will remain frenzied until they are broken in hand-to-hand combat, or until there is no enemy within charge reach. Compulsory charges may be avoided on a successful leadership test. Frenzied troops that charge fight with double their attack dice in hand-to-hand combat. Note that this is their attacks ×2 and does not include bonuses for close combat weapons. Frenzied troops may not normally parry, though Khorne Berserkers may, due to their incredible fencing skills. Frenzied troops must always use their 2-inch follow-up move to get closer or to engage the enemy. While frenzied, troops are unaffected by other psychology. Frenzied troops broken in hand-to-hand combat instantly lose the frenzy status and must flee like any other troops. Should they later rally, they are unaffected by their former frenzy. Khorne Berserkers also have the Furious Charge special rule, meaning that when they charge to engage in combat, their move is tripled rather than the usual double move. However, if that will not get them into hand-to-hand combat, they cannot use this ability. This ability is also conferred on characters joining them, so stick Abaddon in Terminator armor with these boys and watch him do a 12-inch charge. Models not on foot, such as those riding a Juggernaut of Khorne or flying on a Disc of Tzeentch, may not gain this bonus. And finally, Khorne Berserkers may rapid fire like other Chaos Space Marines. That is, if they stand still, but really, when is this ever likely to happen? I began my journey of painting non-metallic metal gold with Humbrol 251 brown to base the areas that would later be gold. And then I layered on this old paint vermin brown. I have many old paints in my collection. Some like this are probably 20-ish years old, but they're still usable. I decided to leave washes out of this step and just layer on lighter shades progressively, covering less area each time with each successive lighter shade. The colour following vermin brown was Avalanche Sunset, but rather than painting this on neat, I mixed in some vermin brown that was already on my wet palette to create a transition colour. After this was neat Avalanche Sunset, then Avalanche Sunset mixed with dark sand, and finally a sharp edge highlight of just dark sand. Any studs or rivets also got a spot of dark sand. It seemed like a time-consuming process, and for sure, it would have been easier to paint on gold and then shade with a wash, but actually, using a wet palette meant I could mix the colours more easily, and building up the highlights one after the other on the same model was faster than I expected, and also quite satisfying. So I have no regrets choosing this method, and I feel I'm a little better at non-metallic metal now. And here's both the metal and the plastic model with all the highlights done on the gold. It was time to move on to the green, since again, this was used in these photos from the old rulebook. I began with Caliban green, painting the chest strap, the chainsword, and some detail on the back of the backpack, including these pipes and whatever these are under the vent stalks. Apparently these old backpacks are from Anvilus pattern power armor, which made for an interesting read when I did some research about it. But lore justification aside, I think they look rad as hell. Once the Caliban green was dry, it was time to layer on some lighter shades. Again, in my bottomless pit of old paints, I found this scorpion green, which, due to some marvel of engineering, was still quite liquid enough to move from the pot to the palette with ease. I mixed some of this with Caliban green, about 50-50, and painted all but the bottom edges of the backpack cables and chest straps. I'm going to focus on these areas before I commit to the chainsword, for which I have something special planned. The next layer again, covering less area than before, was pure scorpion green. I painted probably the upper third of the pertinent area, taking care not to allow the paint to slip into the hard recesses of the pipes or straps. I only wanted Caliban green to show there. If I made a mistake, I went back with my thinnest brush and painted in a fine line with Caliban green. Finally, I mixed some white into scorpion green and edge highlighted the upper areas of each section I had been working on. The plan for the chainsword was to have a smooth gradient from Caliban green at the bottom to scorpion green at the top. And boy, was this a challenge. I had watched some tutorials and I knew the theory behind glazing, but theory and practice don't often align when my hand is on the brush. At this stage, I want to thank Vincent from Bunker 6 for taking the time to provide me with advice on glazing. I really did try to channel my inner Vincent here, but I will concede I still have a way to go. At first I painted on some scorpion green mixed with matte medium to reduce the opacity of the paint, but still scorpion green alone was too bright to layer on, so to mitigate the damage I painted over some Caliban green thin with water. I continued using medium to reduce opacity, but this time I used various mixes of Caliban green and scorpion green to layer on a transition, using a higher proportion of scorpion green the further I got to the tip of the chainsword. There were plenty of mistakes along the way, but patience and repetition soon ironed them out. Sometimes painting these more challenging parts just requires practice and experimentation, a bit like navigating a corn maze without a map. You just have to play it by ear. And here's the sword finished. The next job was to sort out the black areas. If you've watched me paint black before, you'll know it always involves Thunderhawk blue. I mix this with a touch of black and layer it on around the edges of the pouches, the bolt gun, this brooch or clasp or whatever in the middle of his chest, and on the uppermost part of the black knee pad. Then I take pure Thunderhawk blue to edge highlight each area a little more sharply. I'm usually more rough on the pouches to emulate cracked leather. The chainsword hilt also got this treatment. The final highlight was a sharp line of Fenrisian grey, which I also applied to any rivets and studs. Now onto the skulls, of which there were many, because, 40k. I paint these an earthy brown to begin with, then a mixture of this earthy brown with a beige like dark sand. I find it useful to remove some moisture onto a kitchen towel for this step and apply a couple of thin layers. If the spirit moves me, I sometimes mix some white and sand to do a final highlight on the uppermost parts of the skull. Wherever possible, I try to leave the darker colours showing between the teeth and in the eye sockets, but some of these are so small it often takes a couple of goes to get it right. On to other details. The knee, backpack and bolter each have the symbol of Khorne on them, which I used to believe was a rank insignia for colonel, but I have since learned otherwise. Anyway, Khorne symbols were painted red, eye lenses were based Caliban green, and then given a thin line of scorpion green. Metallic parts on the bolt gun were painted with gunmetal, and this was the only metallic paint I used in these paint jobs. I painted the base with this Naga green I found in a lovely shop in the northeast of England called the Northumbrian Tin Soldier. It's not goblin green, but it's vibrant and silly, just like these chaps. I find painting the top of the base green first, and then adding texture on top of that, saves some time and some effort in the long run. Once I had stuck on some sand that I had found near Blythe, I again painted on Naga green, followed by a light dusting of dark sand. The last step was decals, which I took from this transfer sheet. His left shoulder got the World Eater symbol, and the right shoulder the Khorne symbol. These were applied with Microsol and Microset, and with a coat of matte varnish to seal them in place. And there we have it. 5 World Eaters Khorne Berserkers from the 90s, with a retro vibrant paint job. 1 metal miniature, and 4 plastic miniatures, ready to accompany the rest of my small Chaos Warband into battle. And I've decided to give each one of them a name. Sweet, Cob, Flakes, Pop, and Dog. I'm very pleased with how these turned out, and I've honed some skills along the way, so allow me to hold them here in front of the camera a while and admire them. But I'm not sure that I'm finished with the Servants of Khorne just yet. I've got a Khorne the Betrayer lined up to paint, and even this guy, if he can legitimately go with the 2nd edition army. And since the painting is done, I suppose it's song time. Ready? Khorne Berserker, swinging his chainaxe, firing his bolt gun, charging his victim. A rapturous war cry fills his surroundings. Blood for the blood gods, goes to the skull throne. Blood for the blood gods, goes to the skull throne. He plunges the chainaxe into his torso, revs up the chainaxe, his body explodes, covered in sinews, laughing and chanting. Blood for the blood gods, goes for the skull throne. Blood for the blood gods, goes to the skull throne. Butcher's nails pulsing, raging convulsing, unquenchable bloodlust, insatiable cruelty, leads him to Khorne's throne, wailing his worship. Blood for the blood gods, goes to the skull throne. Blood for the blood gods, goes to the skull throne. Blood for the blood gods, goes to the skull throne. Blood for the blood gods, goes to the skull throne. And with that, I had better go paint some more minis. Take care, and thanks for watching.